All right, so today we are diving into transforming food systems for climate action. We've got this toolkit created for COP28 by a bunch of groups like WWF and FAO. It's basically a guide for policymakers on how to integrate food systems into national climate plans like those NDCs and NFPs.
Yeah, it's not just another report, though. It really gets into the specifics, offering advice on how to actually make these policy changes happen. It even talks about the financial mechanisms needed and suggests some on-the-ground initiatives.
That's what we need, right? Like actual concrete solutions.
Hmm.
Before we get into all that, though, I think we need to talk about just how urgent this is. You know, the IPCC report makes it pretty clear. If we stopped all non-food emissions today, our food systems alone could still push us past that 1.5 degrees C warming limit.
It's a huge challenge. We always hear about things like transportation and energy, but food systems are a major contributor to climate change, too.
And it's the whole cycle, too.
Right.
Production, processing, distribution, consumption, even the food we waste. Plus, it's not just carbon dioxide, right? You've got methane from livestock and rice paddies, nitrous oxide from fertilizers.
It's a whole cocktail of greenhouse gases. And what makes this even more complex is how interconnected it is. You can't talk about food systems without talking about water scarcity, deforestation, and biodiversity loss.
Yeah, everything's linked. Which brings us back to the toolkit and how it emphasizes this systemic approach. It really gets into the specifics of using national climate plans, those NDCs and NFPs, to tackle these interconnected challenges. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of those plans, I'm curious, what do you make of the increased focus on food systems in those national plans? Is it just lip service, or do you think there's been a genuine shift in global thinking?
Oh, I definitely think there's a growing recognition that we can't address climate change without transforming food systems. It's not just an environmental issue anymore. It's become a mainstream policy concern. More and more countries are realizing that sustainable food systems are vital for national security and economic stability.
Makes sense. It's not just about saving the planet, it's about survival, right? Which is
Yeah.
a pretty powerful motivator. Now, the toolkit isn't all doom and gloom. It also has some concrete recommendations for policymakers. What were some of the key highlights for you?
I think one of the most compelling aspects is the emphasis on participatory governance. The toolkit really stresses involving all stakeholders in the decision-making process, from small-scale farmers to indigenous communities to industry leaders and, of course, policymakers. That inclusivity is crucial to ensure that solutions are equitable and address the needs of those most affected by climate change.
Okay, but in practice, how do we guarantee that those marginalized voices are actually heard? How do we avoid just tokenizing them? And how does the toolkit address the inherent power imbalances that often silence those most vulnerable?
Well, the toolkit acknowledges these challenges. It emphasizes building capacity at the local level, empowering communities to meaningfully participate, and establishing accountability mechanisms. It also highlights the importance of recognizing and respecting traditional knowledge systems, especially within indigenous communities, which hold so much valuable knowledge about sustainable food production and adapting to a changing climate.
So it's not just about having everyone in the room, it's about creating an environment where everyone's voice actually carries weight. Now, another big thing the toolkit talks about is smart finance. I'm assuming we're not just talking about throwing money at the problem, right?
Definitely not. It's about being strategic with financial resources. For example, the toolkit suggests redirecting agricultural subsidies, many of which currently support environmentally damaging practices, and instead investing in agroecological approaches that are both good for the environment and good for farmers.
That reminds me of that crazy statistic. Only 4.3% of global climate finance goes to food systems. That's a shockingly low number, considering how critical the issue is.
Yeah, that funding gap is a major problem, and the toolkit argues for a complete shift in how we think about these investments. It's about considering the long-term costs and benefits of food systems, not just immediate profits. Things like accounting for environmental degradation, public health issues linked to unsustainable food production, and the social costs of food insecurity.
So basically, we need to look beyond the sticker price of food.
Exactly. That's what true cost accounting is all about. It's moving beyond the price you see at the grocery store and recognizing the full impact of our food choices. Like, imagine seeing a burger on the menu, and the price reflects not just the ingredients and labor, but also the water used to raise the cow, the methane emissions from its digestion, the deforestation linked to cattle ranching, and the potential health impacts of eating a lot of meat.
Okay, yeah, so we need to stop pretending that food just magically appears in the supermarket. We need to see that whole interconnected web of resources and impacts that goes into putting food on our plates.
Exactly. True cost accounting helps us see those hidden costs and hopefully incentivizes more sustainable choices.
Okay, so we've got a good foundation now. We understand the urgency, the complex challenges, and some key principles for action. But how does this actually play out in the real world? Are there countries actually implementing these ideas and seeing results?
Oh, absolutely. The toolkit is full of inspiring examples of countries that are leading the way in food systems transformation, demonstrating that change is not just possible, it's already happening.
Well, I'm definitely eager to hear about them. Let's take a trip around the world and see what we can learn from these trailblazers.
These good practice examples are so interesting. They really show that change is possible. Instead of looking at them as separate categories, maybe we could look at the national level policies and the on-the-ground projects together.
I like that. Because it is all connected, really. So where should we start our global tour?
Let's start with Kenya. They're taking a really comprehensive approach to climate-resilient agriculture. They're trying to transform everything, crops, livestock, fisheries, to be able to handle the impacts of climate change.
Kenya is already dealing with some pretty bad droughts and unpredictable rainfall. It seems like this is more of a necessity than just a nice to have. What makes their approach different from other countries?
Well, they're not just focused on increasing yields, they're also putting social safety nets in place specifically to protect vulnerable groups. Like, they've got drought insurance programs for pastoralist communities, and they're providing smallholder farmers with access to climate-smart technologies.
So it's this two-pronged approach, adapting to the changing climate and also making sure that the people most at risk are protected. That's really interesting. Okay, where should we go next?
Let's look at Colombia. They're kind of leading the way when it comes to true cost accounting, especially in their big agricultural sectors like cocoa and coffee.
Instead of just tracking emissions, are they actually factoring those costs into the price of their goods? That seems like a pretty radical step, especially for products that are traded globally.
They haven't gone that far yet, but they're definitely making progress when it comes to measuring and reporting those environmental and social costs of production. They actually passed a law in 2019 specifically focused on reducing food waste. They're recognizing just how much wasted food costs us economically and environmentally.
It sounds like they're putting their money where their mouth is. I like that. What about a country that's doing something completely different? Maybe one that's using more traditional practices?
Well, how about Vanuatu? It's a Pacific island nation, and they're facing some really unique challenges, especially because they're so vulnerable to climate change. They've already got rising sea levels, more intense cyclones, and saltwater intrusion, all of which threaten their ability to produce food.
Wow, that sounds scary. What are they doing to adapt?
They're using a mix of traditional knowledge and modern innovations, so they're bringing back those indigenous agroforestry systems, which are naturally resilient to climate shocks. And they're also working on community-based mangrove restoration projects to protect their coastlines from erosion and storm surges.
I love how those mangrove forests are like natural barriers, protecting the environment and coastal communities at the same time. It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. But I imagine they must be struggling with things like resources and capacity building.
Yeah, for sure. That's why international collaboration is so important. Vanuatu is working with groups like the FAO and the Global Environment Facility to get funding and expertise so they can adapt.
These big national efforts are so inspiring. But what about some more specific projects that are using the ideas from this toolkit in a really hands-on way?
Okay, well, there's this really cool project in Sudan called Gums for Adaptation and Mitigation. It's all about improving gum Arabic production. Basically, they're incentivizing smallholder farmers to protect acacia trees because they're the source of gum Arabic. They give them training, tools, and access to markets so they can sell the gum they sustainably harvest.
So they're not just planting trees, they're making sure people have a reason to protect the trees that are already there. Smart. What are the benefits for the climate?
Acacia trees are super resilient to drought and heat, and they're really good at carbon sequestration. So protecting them helps people and the planet.
I love when sustainable solutions also make good economic sense.
Yeah.
What other innovative projects are out there?
Well, in Palestine, they're using data and technology to help agriculture adapt to climate change. They've got these upgraded weather networks and demonstration plots where they show off climate-smart techniques. And they're running training programs to teach farmers how to understand climate data and use it to make decisions about their farms.
It's like they're giving them the knowledge they need to deal with all the uncertainties of a changing climate.
Oh.
Okay, I'm ready for another example.
All right, let's talk about Cambodia's Pearl Project. It's all about building climate resilience through business plans for premium value chains. They work with farmers to grow high-value crops like rice, mango, and cashews, and then they make sure those farmers can get climate-smart technologies like solar-powered water pumps and drip irrigation systems.
So they're not just adapting to climate change, they're also building a stronger and more profitable agricultural sector. That's a pretty powerful combo. It seems like these projects are showing that a sustainable food system can be good for the environment, and good for the economy.
Exactly. And that's a message that we need to be shouting from the rooftops. We need to share these success stories and find ways to replicate them so we can speed up the transition to a more sustainable and fair food future.
Speaking of sharing and replicating, what does the toolkit say about knowledge transfer and capacity building? It's one thing to have these awesome examples, but how do we make sure that other countries and communities can learn from them? And how can they adapt those solutions to their own situations?
Yeah, that's a really good point. The toolkit really stresses the importance of creating platforms for knowledge sharing and peer-to-peer learning. It specifically talks about South-South cooperation. That's where countries in the global South share their knowledge and experience with each other. It makes sense because they often face similar challenges and have already come up with some really creative solutions that could work in other places.
So it's about building a whole network of innovators and problem solvers.
Yeah.
I like that. Now, switching gears a bit, I want to talk about consumers. The toolkit seems to focus a lot on policymakers and these big initiatives. But what about all the everyday decisions we make about the food we eat? How much power do we have as individuals to change the food system?
I think it's a good point. While those big systemic changes are really important, individual actions do add up. Our food choices, our shopping habits, even how much food we waste at home, all of that shapes demand.
So it's not just about voting with our dollars, it's voting with our forks,
Yeah.
right? What are some things people can do every day to actually make a difference?
There are a ton of things. Cutting back on meat, especially red meat, is one of the biggest things you can do because livestock farming has such a big environmental impact. You can also try to eat locally sourced, seasonal produce to cut down on transportation emissions and support farmers in your area. And we can all try to waste less food.
All good tips. But sometimes it feels like those individual actions are so small compared to the scale of this problem. How do we bridge that gap between personal responsibility and changing the system?
Well, I think it's important to remember that our individual actions aren't just about reducing our own impact. They're also about sending a message to businesses that there's a demand for more sustainable options. When consumers choose plant-based alternatives, support regenerative agriculture, and demand transparency in the supply chain, companies pay attention. And then policymakers do too.
So it's about starting a ripple effect that could lead to bigger changes. Now, before we wrap up this part, I want to go back to financing. We talked about the need for smart investments, but where's the money going to come from? Is there enough to support this kind of transformative change?
That's the million-dollar question. We need a ton of money, both public and private, to make this transition to a sustainable food system happen. The toolkit mentions some things like getting rid of harmful subsidies, using climate finance mechanisms, and attracting impact investors who want to see both financial returns and a positive impact.
But getting rid of those subsidies can be a real political headache, right?
Yeah.
How does the toolkit deal with those kinds of real-world obstacles?
Yeah, those are really tough challenges. The toolkit talks about the need for strong political will and good communication strategies to overcome those who benefit from the current system and to get people on board with these changes. It also talks about the need to work with the private sector. More and more businesses are realizing that climate change poses both risks and opportunities, and they're starting to look for ways to invest in more sustainable practices.
So it's not just governments, it's about everyone understanding that investing in sustainable food systems is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do.
Exactly. It's about changing how we think about this transition, not seeing it as a burden, but as a chance for economic growth, job creation, and a healthier planet for everyone.
Okay, so we've looked at some inspiring examples from around the world. We've talked about what we can do as individuals and about the complicated world of financing a sustainable food future.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear that there's a lot of work ahead. But it also seems like things are starting to move in the right direction. What's the main message you want listeners to take away from this conversation?
The main takeaway is that transforming food systems isn't some far-off dream. It's happening right now. There are new and innovative solutions popping up all over the place, from small community projects to national policy changes. And every single one of us can help speed up this transition, whether it's through the food we choose to eat, speaking up for change, or investing in sustainable solutions.
I love that idea of collective action. We don't have to wait for someone else to fix this problem. We all have a part to play in creating a more sustainable food future.
Exactly, and that's what I really like about this toolkit. It's not just a guide for policymakers. It can inspire and empower anyone who cares about where their food comes from and the future of our planet.
Well, that's a great point to pause on. We'll be back in a bit to wrap up our exploration. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this COP28 toolkit on transforming food systems. It's all about taking action on climate change, and we've covered a lot of ground so far, from how urgent this issue is to the awesome things that are already happening around the world. Before we wrap things up, though, I want to go over a few more key takeaways from this toolkit.
You know, one of the things that really stands out to me is the emphasis on thinking about this as a system. It goes beyond those old ways of looking at things in isolation, and it recognizes how connected food systems are with climate change, biodiversity, social justice, economic development, all of it.
Yeah, it's like that saying, you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it. We need a completely different way of looking at this, something that gets to the root of all these interconnected challenges.
Right. And the toolkit talks about the need for policies that work together, collaboration across different sectors, and taking a long-term view. We have to think about all the impacts and trade-offs.
So it's not just about making a few small changes here and there. It's about fundamentally changing how we think about and manage our food systems. The toolkit also talks a lot about how important innovation is in making this transformation happen. What are some of the key areas where we need to see more innovation?
Well, I think agricultural practices are a big one. We need to develop crops that can handle the changing climate. We need to find ways to use less synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. And we need to be promoting those regenerative farming techniques that improve soil health and biodiversity.
It's amazing how those regenerative practices can actually help us capture carbon in the soil. It's like turning agriculture from a climate problem into a climate solution. What other areas are ripe for innovation?
Well, food processing and distribution are definitely areas where we can do better. We need to reduce waste, become more efficient, and make sure that nutritious food gets to the people who need it most. And technology can help with that. Things like precision agriculture, to use resources better, and blockchain to make supply chains more transparent.
Yeah, there are all these new food tech startups doing really interesting things. It's a really exciting field to watch. Okay, I know we've already talked about this, but I want to go back to the role of consumers. Beyond just making better choices ourselves, how can we work together to make bigger changes in the food system?
Consumer activism is so important. We can support businesses that align with our values, speak up for policies that make food systems more sustainable, and hold companies accountable for their impact.
So it's not just about what we buy, it's also about making our voices heard and using our purchasing power to push for change. As we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a sense of hope. Despite all the challenges, what makes you optimistic about the future of food?
Honestly, it's the people. There's a growing movement of people who really care about food and its connection to climate change, social justice, and how it affects our well-being. There's this whole new generation of farmers, entrepreneurs, scientists, and activists who are finding new solutions and working hard to create a food system that's better for everyone and the planet.
Yeah, it feels like sustainability is finally becoming mainstream, which gives me a lot of hope.
Exactly. And as more people realize that the choices they make about food are connected to the health of the planet, I think we have a real shot at creating a food future that's both delicious and just.
That's definitely a future worth fighting for.
Yeah.
And as we've seen from this COP28 toolkit, we've got the knowledge, the tools, and the power to make it happen.
That's right.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.